Hey everybody, how you doing? I wanted to talk today about the best period of classic rock. What is the best period of classic rock? And the premise of this talk is going to be that the best period of classic rock is 1968 to 1973. I know those are kind of arbitrary. I know those are kind of arbitrary dates, and there's so much great music. It's kind of ridiculous in a way to segment those, was it 5 years? But I've thought about it, and I wanted to talk a little bit about it. So let me just preface by saying that was a really great period in culture in a lot of ways. You know, the Vietnam War was going on in that period, and as horrible as that war was, and all the lessons it taught us that we'd never seemed to learn, and the body bags that came home. I remember when a guy in our church came home in a body bag and how horrible that was, and I remember us praying for his parents in church, and oh my gosh. But it is kind of weird that out of a time of war often comes great music. I don't know why that is. There's certainly great songs associated with the Civil War on both sides. I think you could say about any war, there are certain songs that sort of capture people's hearts during times of trouble and war. And that, I don't know if the Vietnam War had anything to do with it, but I heard an interesting analogy once. A guy was talking about movies, actually, and I thought what he said about movies applied to music too. In 1968, that was a really interesting time. So if you think about 1968, in the early 60s, you still had like Leave It to Beaver, Mary Poppins was popular, The Sound of Music came out in 1964. I guess I was tossing in some television there, kind of wholesome. They didn't even have ratings, I think, in that period, because everything was rated what we would today consider rated G, and G didn't mean for kids. They didn't have ratings, but G wasn't what we would call today G. Was just family mainstream entertainment. There really wasn't anything else. But he said something interesting about the year 1968. I hope I don't miss any dates in this, but in 1968, the movie Midnight Cowboy came out, and also the movie Hello Dolly came out. Now, Hello Dolly was old Hollywood. Old Hollywood was the studio system, and it was a musical. It was wholesome. It was funny. It had song and dance and an orchestra and a big cast and big numbers, but it was old school Hollywood. And that was also the studio system, where they had the movie studios kind of had staffs and actors on staff and kind of ran everything. And if you think about it, music was kind of like that. Studios and record companies used to make all the music. And by the way, that's good. The Hello Dolly is a great movie, as are so many movies that the studio system produced. I'm not cutting that down in any way. In some ways, they had it down to a T, and they made some great movies and some, But yeah, in music, it was kind of like that too, because you had like certain parts of the country that would just crank out hit record after hit record. The Brill Building in New York, I think Carole King and so many great songs came out of that. And in the Brill Building in New York, you'd have a songwriter in one room. He'd write a song in the morning, put it on a lead sheet. They'd run it over to the next room, and there'd be a guy with the songwriter probably played piano back then, and in the next room they'd have a little rhythm section, and they'd go through it, and the singer maybe run through it and clarify anything, and and then they'd do some rhythm tracks, and then break for lunch, and then they'd come back in the afternoon and toss some vocals in there, and by 5 o'clock they'd have themselves a hit record, and it might even be on the radio within a few days. I'm not really exaggerating that much. That's how a lot of and they were great songs. And the Wrecking Crew was kind of like that. Muscle Shoals in the South, different parts of the country had their own kind of versions of that. And but that was good for songwriters, by the way, because a lot of artists in that period, like Elvis, I guess would be a good example. They didn't really write many, if any, of their own songs, and so they'd kind of have these stars. Like Motown was like that, and then they'd have songwriters behind the scenes and musicians behind the scenes that did all those great records. And Hollywood, that's kind of comparable to the Hollywood studio system. Now, in 1968, Hello Dolly came out, which is sort of one of the it's often cited as one of the last of the studio system films, or, of that type. It's kind of old Hollywood, kind of golden age of Hollywood. That was kind of one of the last ones they ever did like that. But that same year, Midnight Cowboy came out. And that's a great movie. Everybody's talking at me with Harry Nilsson sang that beautiful song in there. And I don't know the movie that well, actually, but I know it was originally rated X. And it was kind of edgy, and, it had Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight, I believe, in the starring roles. But it was edgy and, kind of gritty. And that was New Hollywood, and that was originally rated X, but in the next several years, you had a lot of freedom, and that kind of broke when the old studio system broke up. And Midnight Cowboy kind of represents the breakup of the old movie studio system. For the next several years, a lot of filmmakers had a lot of freedom, and and there were some great movies made. All through the late 60s and on into the mid-70s. I've always thought it's a really great period for films. Of course, you had absolute classics like The Godfather, which I do think they're in that kind of sweet spot. They, Francis Ford Coppola, they had all kinds of liberty. The directors just kind of ran their own show in a way that maybe they wouldn't have 20 years before. I don't know. But there sure was some good movies in that period, and they had a kind of different feel. And along with the big, epics like The Godfather, I just remember there were a lot of little quiet movies. There were a lot of good drive-in movies, even, actually, and even the bad drive-in movies were often kind of good, because again there was less oversight. Oversight can be good, but there was less oversight, and they needed a lot. They were just cranking out movies, and so you had a period where there were a lot of great movies, and I think in music that is sort of followed that pattern in music, because in the late late 60s, you had, right around that same time, you started to have bands that wrote their own songs. Of course, Dylan and the Beatles kind of pioneered that in a way, didn't they? The singer-songwriters, we use the term singer-songwriter today. We kind of associate with folk music, like James Taylor or whatever. But it really, like the Beatles wrote their own songs. A lot of those bands wrote their own songs. And they had so much more artistic freedom, and the controls that had been in music for years through radio stations and everything kind of broke up. And And so you had, starting around 1968, some really great music, and there was a lot of freedom, and artists were able to do all kinds of things that they maybe wouldn't be able to get away with. I think Pete Townsend said we were liberated from the 4-minute song, right? That was, and they really meant it. You know, those old, a lot of those singles, they couldn't even be 3 minutes. I saw the guy that wrote Brandy. He did an interview on this Professor of Rock channel, which I really enjoy. He's got a good channel. But he interviewed the guy that wrote Brandy, which is a song from this period, actually. And the guy said they trimmed it down. I think they got it to like 2:59 because if it was over 3 minutes, DJs wouldn't play it. 3 minutes on those old AM radio stations. So the ability to write longer songs, be more creative, that was a real breakthrough. And it sort of came of age in the late 60s. And I do think that Hollywood analogy is kind of apt. And really, if you think about it, films and music are kind of two sides of the same coin. They're arts and creativity and culture and so on. Now, the other part of that analogy that guy said was in 1976, you had Star Wars come out. Now, Star Wars, I know a lot of people love Star Wars. I remember seeing it, and I remember seeing it when it came out, and it was just a mind blower, all those lightsabers and everything. Today, there's so many special effects, but the Death Star, you can't imagine what that was like, you know, if you'd grown up on 50s movies or something to see those special effects. But it was kind of the beginning of a big change in Hollywood because it's often called the first blockbuster. The first blockbuster. And, you know, that was an interesting thing. So after that, you know, these Hollywood, you know, it all became, the emphasis was on the big blockbuster, toy tie-ins. You know, everything had to have some kind of tie-in in the toy aisle, or McDonald's Fun Meals, and, you know, T-shirts and branding logos. You know, that Star Wars became kind of a logo, and it was all kind of marketing, and that really changed Hollywood. And how big was your opening weekend? All those kinds of things that we tend to associate movies with today. At least we did till a few years ago. Sometimes I think Hollywood's changing again. Maybe they need to, huh? But the interesting thing that guy said, by the way, I've got some albums here. I got to talking. But the interesting thing that guy said was one of the first albums that was kind of like Star Wars, it kind of has a similar role, was Boston. Now, this is not a cut down of Boston. This is one of the great rock and roll albums ever made, and it was also, by the way, an indie project. Yeah, I'm sure most of us know the story of how Tom Scholz put this together, but it was so good. And like I said, I remember hearing this. My friend in Wheaton, Illinois, had one of the greatest album collections I've ever seen, and one of the greatest stereos. Back in those days, you know, everybody had to have a great stereo. And I remember going over to his house. This would be in the fall of 76, and he had this album, and no one had heard it yet, and he played it for me. And it sounded to me like Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Now I realize it's really, it's not like that at all. It's a rock and roll band, but I remember it sounded like really FM rock. But by the spring, this thing was huge. I remember that very distinctly. I remember the first time I heard this album, and this guy had it, and no one had ever heard it. So that's one of the advantages of being a little older. But it was kind of like Star Wars in the sense that it was so huge that it was a blockbuster. And it was a blockbuster, and, you know, albums changed. And after that, there's still a lot of great music in the late 70s. There's great music. Anytime you have people making music, there's great music. But music does have kind of a cultural context, you know, and it's probably kind of hard to write great music in North Korea. I hate to pick on North Korea, but I often use it as an example of how politics, society can affect music, you know. And you do have these kind of sweet periods where there's freedom, there's smart people that are interested in hearing what musicians do, and, you know, all the sort of dynamics that go along with making a great music scene are in place, because it's not just enough to have, you know, somebody really talented. You have to have the a world that can support and listen to that person. So Boston was kind of the that first album like that. And a band, I wouldn't put them in the same category as Boston, but Foreigner was kind of like that. And so in the mid-'70s, you started to have what sometimes is called formula rock. Formula rock. So that's a very interesting thing. So Formula Rock was where they kind of got it, hey, what did that Boston do? Let's do it just like that. Now, Boston was innovator. They were innovators and they were creators, but, you had people, hey, how did they do that? It's kind of like Star Wars. How did they do that? We need to do that again. We just made millions of dollars. Let's do it again. Let's get it down to a T. We'll do that every stinking time. And so in the late 70s, you had what I remember being called formula rock. And that was kind of where the artists would they would have sort of formulas that there was thought to create certain hits, sort of, you need this many bars before the singer starts maybe, or, the solo should be this long, and also probably formulas in terms of certain musical idioms or even how it was recorded and things like that. But the interesting period between 68 and maybe the mid-'70s, I said 73, but between 68 and the mid-'70s, you had that kind of period where the old studio system and kind of in music, all those old record companies running everything, and DJs, of AM stations running everything, that kind of broke down for several years. And that, if you think about it, that's the heyday of classic rock. Late 70s, there's some great bands in the late 70s, but it was pretty different. And I think that's if you think about it, Zeppelin, so many of what the really, really vintage legacy classic rock artists come out of that sweet spot. A lot of times they emerged from the 50s and 60s, but they kind of they were sort of in the right place at the right time, and in those few years that produced some of the best music that we'll be listening to, I believe, in for centuries. Kind of like the way we, some of the music that came out of Vienna for a while there was, like Beethoven and just one city. It kind of attracted people, and it was supported by the culture and even the political system or whatever of Vienna. So So that was really interesting. But I wanted to add one other point, which was I remember listening to radio in that period because I was a kid in that period. So I'm talking about my youth. So in 68, I would have been a kind of little league playing kid. And like by the mid-'70s, I was entering into high school age. So I was listening to the radio that whole time. 68, I was still pretty young. I remember when the Tigers won the World Series in 68. That was great. But some of this, I really started listening to music first. It was AM, CKLW. And I remember very specifically when I started listening to it, Don McLean, American Pie, Horse with No Name. I'm just thinking of some of the songs that were popular then. But a cool thing about AM radio at that time was it was so diverse, and a lot of hard rock was on AM radio. Now FM was coming out. FM, of course, I think the technology went back, but most radio was AM. And I remember this a little bit. FM, when it first came out, had a better sound, but there it was kind of like just the Wild Wild West. And I remember WABX in Detroit was like this, WXRT in Chicago was like this, and I think a lot of cities had something comparable, these underground FM stations. And that was where album-oriented rock came on, because I was a little too young to appreciate it, so I didn't really listen to it that much. But when I lived in Chicago for a while, WXRT was still like that for a while, and they would just play whole album sides, you know. You say, I'm gonna play side one of Electric Ladyland, you know, and then he'd just play it. And if there were any ads, they'd be for, you know, Bill's Head Shop down the street. Then some guy might come in and read some poetry, and then they might play some Joan Baez. I mean, they just did whatever they wanted. There was no format. It was very hippie, so I mean, they kind of catered to those tastes. But, you know, on Beethoven's birthday, they might play a whole symphony. I mean, I just remember WXRT played anything. But AM radio was really cool in that period, because you had, I've got some other albums here. You had bands like Three Dog Night. See, Three Dog Night was, I mean, we would consider them an AM band, but they were a rock band. I mean, they had organ, electric guitars, killer vocals. I mean, they were fantastic if you haven't heard Three Dog Night much. But another band kind of like that is Sugarloaf. So you would hear this stuff on AM. Now, Sugarloaf, they did that song called Green-Eyed Lady, if you can see that. Green-Eyed Lady. Green-eyed lady, lovely lady. It's got a big organ solo in it. It's kind of psychedelic, but that was an AM hit. Alice Cooper had a ton of AM hits, you know, that were like, they'd say, okay, that was John Denver, Rocky Mountain High, and, you know, and before that we heard Karen Carpenter singing I'm on Top of the World. Now we're going to hear Alice Cooper sing School's Out or Hello Hooray, and no irony, that they would just play it. So hard rock, what we would call hard rock in the early 70s, was just mixed into AM formats. Deep Purple, Smoke on the Water, was a huge AM hit. Another one was Golden Earring, Radar Love. I mean, there's so many, if I start naming them. But like in the early 70s, rock music, hard rock music, was on AM radio. But the interesting thing is, because it was hard rock music, but a lot of times it had a radio-friendly edge. And if you think about a lot of those Alice Cooper songs, Hello Hooray, School's Out, No More Mr. Nice Guy, Teenage Lament 74, all those songs are catchy. Same with the Stones from that period. Brown Sugar, they're catchy as hell. Radar Love, that's a hard rock song. Please don't ever listen to that driving fast in your car, but it's a hard rock song. But it's catchy as hell, and that would be mixed right in there with Me and Mrs. Jones, you know. Now we're going to hear Me and Mrs. Jones, which would be soul music. There was a lot of soul, you know, and the racial lines, thankfully, were erasing in music at that time. So there was a lot of soul music, well, at least on that AM station I listened to. You know, you'd hear the Jackson 5, you know, Bill Withers, Ain't No Sunshine When She's Gone. And but rock music was mixed right into that, and that was so great. And so AM music used to be really special. That was before all the politics and everything. You know, there were talk shows on AM, but I think a lot of that was replaced by talking and news. And of course, by the mid-'70s, FM had become huge. For one thing, it sounded better. And there was more freedom. But when more people started listening to FM, that kind of underground FM changed. But the other thing I wanted to say about classic rock is, in that, like the shift from like early 60s rock to formula rock, is it changed album covers too. So let's look at a couple album covers. This is Jefferson Airplane, Surrealistic Pillow. You notice it has the band prominently featured. They very look hippie, but one guy's got a banjo, playing a banjo. Grace Slick has got like a recorder, a tonette, or a flute. But the band is prominently featured. It's a kind of cardboardy cover. It's not glossy. You know, this is REO 2. REO is a good band to use as an example because REO Speedwagon, when I first listened to them, was a hard rock band, but they became kind of a formula rock band. I'm not saying they got worse, but they became, you know, Keep On Loving You and some of those songs they did later were more formulaic. They were good. I'm not saying they weren't good songs. But early REO was, this is REO 2, which is a terrific album. And look, the band's prominently featured. There's the band on the, you know, that's a rock and roll album right there. That's not formula rock. That's a rock and roll band. Look, Gary Richrath. I think this was the first album Kevin Cronin was on. But those are early 70s albums. This is Uriah Heep live. Look at this. This is a classic old, you know, album from this period. You got all these pictures of the band. Look at that. Get a whole book in there. I mean, you'd probably have to pay $20 for a book like that today. All those glossy pictures. Of course, today they'd all be on the internet for free too. So maybe not. But the emphasis was on the band. Now, one of the things that happened. Let me see if I can fish out. You had this is a REO Speedwagon from what I would call more their formula rock days. You notice it's glossier. And this was like by the late 70s, early 80s, a lot of the album covers had changed. The band's not emphasized as much, if at all. See, the band doesn't appear on this. It's kind of glossier too. It doesn't have that kind of rock and roll edge to it. It looks a little more commercial, I guess. Which you can just go through album cover after album cover. This is Orleans. Now here's another change. They were from the mid-70s. By the way, this guy is John Hall. I hope you watch my guitar solos we took for granted video. It was early. I don't know how good it is, but it was. He was one of the guitar solos we took for granted on Still the One. He's a great guitar, and today's a congressman, believe it or not. But you'll notice by the mid-70s, even when they showed the band, it looks like they got a blow dryer around there somewhere, wouldn't you say? You know, I remember in the 70s when there were a lot of men had blow dryers. I even had a blow dryer for a while there. Never worked too well, but here's another one where you can see the blow dryer effect. Look at kind of slick looking. That's Player. That's it, Player. Definitely looks like there's a blow dryer involved. So if you did see the band, that was, you know, times had changed. But this is another good example where this is Styx. Now, Styx was a hard rock band, but I would say they kind of became a more what we might equate with late 70s, early 80s formula rock, or the change in format. This is Pieces of 8, which I believe is 1978. I'll stand corrected. But you notice the band's not on it. It's got this kind of mysterious looking album cover. Now the band is inside. So a lot of these bands, you know, I think you can see that with the change in like Zeppelin albums too. You know, like some like In Through the Outdoor and Presence. The albums kind of have a slicker look to them, just the album covers. This is the second Boston album. Again, the band's not on the cover at all, and it's kind of glossy. It's got more of a gloss. It looks like more commercial product, you know. Where that Surrealistic Pillow looked like there was a certain bootleg quality to it. Now in Boston, you do get the pictures of the band inside. But so many examples like that. I just fished a few out of these of my record collection. This is Uriah Heep. This is Roger Dean, of course, did a lot of the art for Uriah Heep. This is The Magician's Birthday. But Roger Dean's a great artist. I wish I could afford to buy one of his paintings. But of course, he famously did the art for Yes. I think that's Roger Dean. Then Frank Frazetta was another one. I hope that's not Frank Frazetta. I think that's Roger Dean. But there was a lot of art. That's not really commercial. That's like the world of art. You know, it's pretty serious. But it's rock and roll pop art. But it's more like the world of art. It's not a There's not a sense of commercial branding or some kind of you know, the band is sort of an extension of a corporation or a brand. It's more a band as an extension of the arts, and the album cover, I think, reflects that. This is Iron Butterfly, classic. Look at that one. That is not commercial music, class. And here you got the pompous essays. I like a lot of these albums. You'd get literally essays. I've got one here with the whole essay inside. That Eric Clapton history of Eric Clapton. You got an essay. I used to get Dylan albums, and you'd get like a journalist writing like a 5,000 word essay on Dylan on the album jacket. But this has got writing in it, kind of extensive. But that's that earlier period. It's not commercial. The band's featured. It's like the band are artists. They're being featured as artists, and the music feels less like a commercial product and more like an extension of the arts, which I think is so important in music. Nothing wrong with commercial music, by the way. There's been some damn good commercial music, and there's nothing like a little money to give an incentive to people to do their best. So, and pleasing people is one of the things that makes for good music. Because if you just please yourself, it might not please anybody else, and that's probably not good either. But at the end of the day, there was a sweet spot. I always say, it's kind of analog. There was a sweet spot when that kind of record company DJ world of the 50s and earlier 60s kind of broke up, comparable to the way Hollywood broke up. And you ended up with, more freedom for artists and bands. It's reflected in the music. It's even reflected in album covers. And it's just a great period. 1973, you had Sweet City Woman, Sweet City Woman. And then you also had Radar Love. You had Alice Cooper doing coming out with $1 Billion Babies, and they were all on the same station. By even a year or two later, that was less true. But in the early 70s, there was a lot of that rock was just right in the mainstream of AM music, really. I don't think Zeppelin ever really was an AM. I don't think they ever even like Stairway to Heaven. I wonder if that was ever played on AM radio. But the Who certainly had AM hits like My Generation. Kids Are Alright, any of those early songs, those were AM hits. Sort of the Beatles, the Stones were an AM band, sure, yeah, like Let's Spend the Night Together, all those songs were played on AM radio. But in the late 60s, they were able to expand out and do other things, and their albums, when a lot of times when the emphasis was on AM music, albums would have those few hits that were like in the top 40, and then there'd be filler. If you took a band like I would never describe anything the Beatles did as filler, but you definitely had a lot of pretty good bands where they'd have those couple hits, and then the other ones were just kind of filling out the album. They might be pretty good, but it was kind of filler. Whereas the album becomes more of an emphasis in that late 60s period. And the album is sort of an artistic expression, not so much a commercial product. And the irony is, of course, a lot of the albums that came out in that period are like some of the best-selling albums that made more money than ever. But they were meant to be creative expressions, and the fact that they were so successful at that made them successful in other ways. But 1968, and I could say when Boston comes out in 76, I was going to say 73, because I even think by like 74, 75, the money started taking over. Blow dryers, when you start to see album covers change, that means the artists, a lot of those old album covers would be, here's my sister-in-law did this drawing, and they'd stick it on an album cover. A lot of, like Cat Stevens did his own drawings for his album covers. So when corporations and record companies kind of reasserted control in the mid-'70s, I think you even see it reflected in album covers, so like Tea for the Tiller Man is a beautiful Cat Stevens drawing. Is It So, which is one of Cat Stevens' last albums as Cat Stevens, has that kind of glossy look to it. But all Cat Stevens albums are good, but I do think you see that kind of glossier look on later Cat Stevens, as artsy and fartsy as he was, and he always had good art on all his albums. Most of the time, drawn himself. So, anyway, think about it. There's been great music at all times, I guess, but if you think about it, you know, there is a context, and great music has to have a support system. It's just like we all have to have a world to live in. And 68 or so to 73 or 74 or so, that was a really special time in music. And I think, the talent that all people have was able to rise to the fore and had freedom in that period in a way that it didn't quite before and it didn't quite after. Not that there haven't been, at least in terms of the mainstream. you know. And I think there are all kinds of exceptions to that. And some of the music that probably maintained that underground quality I never took to. I think punk kind of replaced a lot of that kind of underground old FM thing, because I used to know some people that were into punk, and I never could get into punk. I tried, even though I like a lot of the groups that are considered forerunners of punk, but I will say that those people were really into there was a kind of underground punk scene. It was very not commercial. I mean, all the kinds of things that rock and roll had 10 years before. I think new wave was kind of like that too. So then MTV came out, and that was another story that takes us into a whole new chapter in music. But that period of 68 to 73 is a great period. Great period. There's no doubt about it. No doubt about it. You had the right people in the right place at the right time and the right set of circumstances in so many different ways. 68 to 73. I'm going to say 73. It could say 74, 75, but I'm going to say 73 because that's when I really think there was just some real, that 5 years, in those 5 short years produced some of the greatest music that we still call classic rock today. Ton of it. So much. God bless you.